My name's Ben Walker, and I want to tell you about the strangest night of my life. I was working an overnight shift at a gas station just off I-95, somewhere out in Maryland. This wasn't exactly your modern, well-lit gas station with a convenience store attached. It was one of those older, tiny places with just 2 pumps, a grimy little cashier's booth, and barely enough light to see anything beyond the pumps after dark. I was new on the job, just picked it up because I needed the extra cash. My manager, Frank, was a local who didn't talk much, except for telling me the basics. Keep to yourself, stay in the booth, don't wander around. He was an old-timer who'd worked in the same spot for decades. Frank didn't seem like the type who got scared easily, but he gave me a piece of advice on my first night. If anyone comes up asking for a favor, anything weird, just say no. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. I figured it would be a boring gig. I mean, who stops for gas at 2 a.m.? The road was quiet. No cars, no noise, just the hum of the fridge behind me and the occasional crackle of static on the radio. But that night, I saw a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. A truck rolled in, an old, beat-up pickup with dents along the side like it had seen better days. It pulled up to pump one, and I watched as the driver climbed out. He was an older guy, maybe mid-50s, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. Seemed like your typical rural guy. He didn't pay at the pump. Instead, he walked over to the window of my booth. I was half asleep, but I got up and cracked the window, feeling the cold night air rush in. "Hey," he said, voice rough like he'd been smoking for years. "Can you help me out? My card's not working at the pump. Could you run it inside?" I glanced at the machine, which seemed fine, and back at the guy. I didn't get a good vibe, but it felt rude to just refuse. "Sure, hand it over," I said, trying to sound casual. He slid his credit card under the glass, and I noticed his hands were shaking. Not the kind of shaky you get from being cold, more like nervous or scared. I swiped his card and it went through just fine, so I handed it back to him. "Thanks," he said, but his eyes didn't leave mine. There was something unsettling in them, like he was looking at me as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, he just muttered, "Be careful out here." Then he went back to his truck, pumped his gas, and drove off into the night. I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to him being tired or maybe drunk. But about 15 minutes later, another car rolled in. A dark sedan this time, windows tinted so dark that I couldn't see a thing inside. It pulled up to pump 2, and I kept my eyes on it, waiting for the driver to get out. But no one did. The car just sat there, engine running, headlights on. I squinted, trying to see inside, but it was just darkness behind those tinted windows. I figured maybe the driver was asleep or something, so I waited another few minutes. But after a while, it started to feel wrong. Like whoever was in that car wasn't planning on getting out. I reached for the little radio on the desk to call Frank, but then I thought about it. What was I going to say? "Hey, Frank, there's a car here and I don't know, it just feels creepy." Didn't seem like much of a reason to wake him up. After about 10 minutes, I decided to step outside. I kept my distance, staying near the booth, but I called out, "Hey, need help or something?" No answer. The car door finally opened, and this guy stepped out. He was tall, with a long trench coat, and he had his hands in his pockets. The headlights were bright enough that I couldn't make out his face, just his silhouette. He didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, staring in my direction. I felt my stomach twist. Something was wrong, but I didn't want to panic, so I kept it cool. "You need gas or what?" Finally, he spoke, but his voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself. "I just need a map." We don't have any maps here," I told him, which was true. We didn't have much of anything besides candy bars and cigarettes. There's a rest stop a few miles up the highway that probably has some, though. The man didn't reply. He just stood there staring. Then, without another word, he got back in his car, closed the door, and drove off. No gas, no map, just gone. I went back inside, trying to shake off the weird feeling, but it wasn't easy. I kept replaying the way he'd looked at me, that strange, empty expression. The quiet settled back in, and I figured that was the end of it. But about half an hour later, I saw headlights again, this time coming from the opposite direction. It was that same dark sedan, rolling back into the station and pulling up to the exact same pump. The guy got out again, and this time he didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't go outside. I locked the door of the booth, hoping he'd just leave, but he didn't. Instead, he walked slowly over to the window, leaned in close, and tapped on the glass. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just grinned, a slow, unsettling smile like he knew something I didn't. "You can't help anyone out here," he whispered, his breath fogging up the glass. I backed away, my heart pounding, and he just stood there, watching me, tapping his finger on the window over and over. I didn't know what to do. I was alone, with no one around for miles. Finally, he turned and walked back to his car, giving me one last look before he got in and drove away. But just as he pulled out of the station, his headlights shone on something on the ground near the pumps, a crumpled piece of paper. I waited until he was long gone before I went out to check. It was an old faded map, worn and creased, with markings all over it, circles around certain towns, notes scribbled in the margins. It looked like it had been left there on purpose, like he wanted me to find it. I took it inside, trying to figure out what to make of it. But as I looked closer, I realized that some of those circled spots, they weren't just random towns. They were places where people had gone missing, places that didn't have any explanations for what had happened. I put that map back outside, locked up the booth, and stayed inside until my shift ended at dawn. After that night, I never worked the graveyard shift again. And to this day, every time I see a car pull up to a gas station late at night, I think about that man, his eerie smile, and that map of lost people.